if you haven't got your Bibles out or whatever, you can go ahead and get those out. But I'm going to start reading in verse 3. And in this we know that we have come to know him, if we keep his commandments. The one saying that I have known him and does not keep his commandments is a liar, and in this one there is no truth, or the truth is not in this one. But whoever keeps his word, truly in this one the love of God has been made perfect, or will be made perfect, In this we have come to know that in him we are. So we are in him. The one saying, I remain in him, ought to walk just as he walked. Verse 7. Beloved, not a new commandment I am writing to you, but, hold on just a second. But an old commandment which was from the beginning. The old commandment is the word which you have heard. The new commandment, let me hold on, let me pull this up. Sometimes the Greek's kind of confusing. Okay, at the same time, it is a new commandment that I am writing to you, which is true in him and in you, because the darkness is passing away, and the true light is already shining. The one saying, whoever says he is in the light and hates his brother is still in darkness. Whoever loves his brother abides in the light, and in him there is no cause for stumbling. But whoever hates his brother is in the darkness and walks in the darkness, and does not know where he is going, because the darkness has blinded his eyes. Okay, so we've got two sections in this. The first section we're going to talk about, which is like a transition from last week. I'm sorry, Aaron, we're in 1 John chapter 2, verse 3 through 11. I didn't see that you asked that. Okay, look at verse 3. It says, and in this we know that we have known him, if we keep his commandments. So, remember how we talked about last week how John makes these conditional statements? Like this book is littered with conditional statements, which is blank if blank. So we know that we know him if we keep his commandments. Now remember, these are people. These are Gnostics, like we just talked about. These are Docetist Gnostics, which have infiltrated the church and have caused this church split. And then, if anybody doesn't know what Gnosticism in the first century is, it comes from the Greek word gnosko or gnosis, which is to know or knowledge, depending on if you want to use the verb or the noun. The idea of Gnosticism is that knowledge or understanding or wisdom, it grants you salvation. You know, you find grace and salvation through your wisdom and understanding and knowledge. So, and there's a lot of Gnostic writings that come about in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd century. All the stuff that Dan Brown writes about, the Da Vinci Code, stuff like that, like the Gospel of Thomas, all those later pseudepigrapha epistles and gospels are, these are all Gnostic things. And remember, the Gnostics loved John's writing because John has a sense of dualism in his writing, which is light versus darkness. Light overcomes the dark, which is good overcoming evil. That's why they take his gospel, which the motif of his gospel is the divinity of Christ, and have taken it so far as to deny his humanity. Okay? So remember, that's what we were talking about last week that John's going to get into. Is he's agreeing with them about the divinity of him, but he is going to go and disagree and show, no, listen, he's human as well, which is what we're going to get into later. But nonetheless, these are Gnostic people. So then, that sets the stage and makes it pretty clear why John would use the phrase of knowing God. It says, in this we know that we have known him if we keep his commandments. So the Gnostics are all about knowing everything. They're all about knowing God, knowing the understanding of the world, and all this stuff. And John just got done ripping these successionists in the first chapter for walking in the darkness, and not having fellowship with him and being sinful. Remember, he said he's the propitiation for our sins, but not our sins alone, but for the whole world. He's talking about how these people are so sinful. And what is sin? Remember, we're going to actually define that later on in chapter 3. But sin is transgression of one of God's laws. Okay, that's just simple. Like if God says don't do this and you do it, you've broken His law, therefore you sin. So he's talking about how these Gnostics are all sinning this whole time, and now he says we know that we know Him if we keep His commandments. So these Gnostic successionists who are breaking off aren't keeping His commandments. Okay? So, when he says we know Him if we keep His commandments, on the other side of that would be if we don't keep His commandments, we don't know Him. Does that make sense? So, he's a roundabout way stabbing at these people who claim to be full of knowledge and full of obedience, and saying, no, you're neither one. You're sinful, unknowledgeable. You don't know Him. Okay? Now, I do like that John is kind of vague on, well, what commandments is this? Is this meaning that Christianity is just a bunch of legalism? No, I don't believe that knowing God at all means you have to keep His commandments. But what happens when you live out the very life that God would want you to live? Like His character is written in His commandments, His instructions. Like if He was alive as a person, and He did, then He would have lived just like that. Okay? So if we're living through those commandments, we know Him because we know exactly how He would function and exactly how He'd conduct Himself. Okay? Let's read verse 4 then. The one saying that I have known Him and does not keep His commandments is a liar. And in this one, the truth is not in him. So, these people are telling, like these successionists are most likely saying, we know Him. Obviously, that's the nature of Gnosticism. We know Him. Okay? So John's saying, if we say that we know Him, remember last time we talked about, is John actually quoting something that these people have been saying, or is this just a hypothetical scenario? I would suggest that it's most likely quoted, or at least he's quoting the idea of what these people are saying. They're saying, we know Him. But that big word in John's letters, if, comes up. So he says, the one saying that, the one saying that I have known Him, but does not keep His commandments, is a liar. So, if you truly know Him, you're going to be keeping His commandments. John's very elementary in his understanding. We have to understand, he's driving this home to all these people because they just don't get it. But remember what the motif of this letter is. Okay, it's written to the church, to John's church, which is going through the split, but it's for comfort. Okay, so these people, put it in your brain. Like think of this building. We can just put it as like a church building. I know we're coming a little out of context, but you got the left half of the church, which would be the Gnostic successionist. You got the right half of the church would be the faithful believers. Okay. Now the left half over here, the Gnostics, they're saying we know Him. We're full of knowledge and wisdom and understanding. We have fellowship with Him. Okay? And all these people on the other side are thinking, well, we do too, but they're seeming kind of like inferior. They feel like they're inferior to these other guys because they have all this quote-unquote knowledge of God and all this. Well, eventually those Gnostics leave the church, and all you've got left is the believers on the right side. So John comes in and writes this letter and says stuff like this. He says that, we know Him if we keep His commandments. He's comforting these people because he knows that the true believers here are the ones keeping His commandments, not the successionists who've left. So this is a comforting letter. Just like last time he said, He is our He is our advocate as well as our hilasmos, the means by which we are saved. So it's not only to expose the heresy of the Docetist Gnostics, but to also comfort the church that is broken right now. So that's why you'd see, like in verse 5, but whoever keeps His word, Truly, in this one, the love of God will be made full, or will be made perfected. How does the ESV render that? Let's see. Is perfected. Okay, the ESV, whoever keeps his word, in him truly the love of God is perfected. That's actually, in the Greek, that word would be past tense, teteliotai. So this is a imperfect verb with the stress on probably the completed action, because getting deep into Greek syntax, depending on how you use a verb, when you use it in the past tense, there's different ideas of what you're stressing. Are you stressing the time that the action was taking place, the finished verb, the finished action, or the results of the action have being finished? I would say that this is probably the results of the action having been finished. John's pretty consistent in that usage, but we're going to go with that then. So let's read that again in verse 5. Whoever keeps his word, truly in this one the love of God has been made perfect. In this we know that we are in him. So if we keep his word, verse 4 says that, the commandment that he wrote was what we heard from the beginning. Okay? I'm sorry, that's going to be in verse 7, I believe. But so he's harking back here to the prologue, which, if you remember it, what was from the beginning, what we have heard, what we have seen with our eyes, what we have looked at, and what we've touched with our hands concerning the word of life. So when he comes back down here in verse 5 and says, he who keeps his word. Now we know in the prologue, when the word was being spoken of, it was the incarnation of the word. It was the man who walked here, our Messiah, our Redeemer, our Christ, that we have heard. So he says here that he who keeps his word, truly in him the love of God has been perfected, or been made full. Now, this is probably a verse which John is, again, comforting the congregation with, because it's something that has happened. Oh, hey, Nikki. Sorry. We'll get her in here, I guess. But, so, this is a comforting verse. He says, the love of God has been made perfect, or made perfected in those who keep his word. Again, he's showing a contrast here, that those who have left are not keeping his word, but those who are keeping his word, they're here. And as we saw, they're walking in the light, as we saw in verse 5 through 10 of last week. Verse 6, the one saying he abides in him ought also to walk as he walked. Okay, now I think this is a summing up of the last three verses. Now, the he here would obviously be Christ, because of the nature of, as he walked. That's what this is completely talking about throughout the first two chapters of this, is what was from the beginning, what we have heard, hearkening back to the prologue of the gospel. The word was in the beginning was the word was with God, and the word was God. And in verse 14, the word was made flesh and dwelt among us. So we are to walk as he walked. If we say that we abide in him. Verse 6 again. The one saying that he abides in him also ought to walk as he walked. Now, someone answered this question. How did Jesus, Yeshua, walk when he was on this earth? How did he walk? What was his character like? What was his conduct like?
He walked on water.
Yes. And so did Peter.
Kinda.
Okay. Chris says perfect with a KT. Yes, okay. More specifically, going back to verse 3, and in this we know that we have known him if we keep his commandments. Do you think that he kept his commandments?
Well, yeah.
Okay. What commandments did he keep?
All of them.
All of them. Just the New Testament ones?
That wasn't written.
It wasn't written yet, was it? Okay, so Jesus walked. Let me first say this: like walking is a Hebrew idiom for how one conducts his or her life. So when you say you walk as he walked, you conduct your life the same way that he conducted his. We know that he was sinless. We know the definition of sin is to break one of God's commandments. Therefore, he broke no commandment of God ever. He had extreme love for the creation of God and the children of God. He was enraged when people would turn the temple into a den of thieves, as he would say. He actually chased them out with a whip of cords. But the most part, he was obedient, and I believe it was Paul in Philippians that talks about he humbled himself as a man, and his obedience was unmatched. His obedience even led him to death on a cross. So Paul seems to believe that his obedience was what led him to the crucifixion that happened. So, yes, zeal for his Father's house consumes him, and I hope that as we're walking as he walked, the same thing would happen for us. Now, I want to ask this question. Well, let me say this. Jesus Christ, Yeshua the Messiah, was a kosher-eating, feast day-keeping, Sabbath-resting Jew who came and lived perfectly. Okay? And I'm not saying we're Jews. But he literally was a Jew because he was from the tribe of Judah. Now, if his life was conducted in such a way that he was completely obedient to every commandment that his father ever spoke, and if you want to get more on this, read Deuteronomy 13 paralleled with John 14, the Gospel of John 14, which is the prophet likened unto Moses. The commandments will be in his mouth, stuff like that. It's really cool. Now, if he was here and he was keeping all of God's commandments, if he was resting on Sabbath, if he was eating clean or kosher or whatever you want to call it, if he was keeping the feast days, if he was loving, if he was honoring his neighbor as himself, loving his neighbor as himself, if he was respecting his mother and father, all these things, revering the name and reputation of his God, if we don't walk just as he did, then do we not have a different set of ethics than he does? He would have ethics standard A over here, which is do this. And then we're over here and we decide, well, we don't want to do this, we'll do this, but we don't want to do this one too much. We've got a different set of ethics as he does. Now, I like to use the analogy that, yes, he came and he done it all. And a lot of people will say, oh, Jesus did that so that I don't have to. Jesus kept the law so I don't have to. A lot of people don't realize that only about 1/3 of the entire Torah, the law of the Old Testament, actually applied to him, because a lot of it applies just to women, a lot of it applies just to the priest, and he was neither of those. A lot of it applies to children, and once he was older, he was not that. So specific laws for women he never did, or never had to worry about, because they literally weren't for him. Same goes for priest. Now, if he comes to do it once so that nobody else has to do it again, is he being more of our example or our excuse not to do them? I typically think that he came to be more as our example and not our excuse. Therefore, if he does something, that should be like follow the leader kind of thing. I should do exactly as he does. I should walk exactly as he does, the same steps, the same paths that he does. As Psalm 23 says, he leads me down paths of righteousness. Isaiah 53 says, my righteous servant makes many righteous. So if he's leading us down paths of righteousness and is making us righteous, then wouldn't he be having to walk down that path in front of us? So if he's walking down this path and we're taking every step that he takes, we would be doing the exact same thing that he did when he lived here. Not taking one step off the straight and narrow path, as Matthew 7 would say, that few find the narrow path that leads to life, but many find the broad path that leads to death and destruction. So when John says, the one which says, I abide in him, also ought to walk just as he walked. So not only is John attacking, not really attacking, but saying these successionists who say that they abide in him, they're not walking as he walked. And they're not abiding in him in reality. And you, church, who have been left over here, if you claim to abide in him, you ought to be walking just as he walked, to the T. Okay? Otherwise, it's not really, as John would say, we know that we know him if we keep his commandments. If we walk just as he walked, exactly as he walked, and lived out that character every day of our lives in our own selves, we would know exactly the character and the standard which he set while he was here 2,000 years ago, and would know him more on a more personal level, because we would literally be doing what he would be doing if he were here. Yes, we're going to stumble and miss the mark as the Hebrew definition of sin would be, but on the same side, we know that we're striving and have that heart, as Ezekiel 36 would say, the heart of flesh which was put into our body and taken the place of the heart of stone, which has the laws of our God written on it, and the Spirit which is in us that leads us to guard his laws and to keep his commandments. So is this kind of making sense right here in these verses? If anybody got a question, just throw it out.
I don't have no questions.
You don't have no questions.
I got one.
Ask away.
Okay, I remember Pastor Stan talking about, how we keep feast days and stuff in heaven. Where is that?
Let me get my English Bible out. Turn to Zechariah 14. Wow, that is cool. I opened my ISR and turned right to it. It's Zechariah chapter 14. If you'll look at verse 16, this is about at the end of time when the new kingdom has come down. In verse 16 it says, and it shall be that all who are left from all of the nations which come up against Jerusalem shall go up from year to year to bow themselves to the King, Yahweh of hosts, and to celebrate the festival of Sukkot, or tabernacles. And it came to be that if any one of the clans of the earth does not come up to Jerusalem to bow himself to the King, Yahweh of hosts, on them there is to be no rain. So you take that and couple that with, I believe it's Isaiah chapter 66. Yeah. You remember how we're talking about, the new heaven and new earth, which are not passed away, obviously, because we're kind of sitting here on Skype right now. And I did that, that short teaching a couple months ago on the heavens and the earth in relation to the law of God. If you'll notice in Isaiah 66, starting verse 22, it says, for as the new heavens and the new earth that I make stand before me, declares Yahweh, so you and your seed shall stand. And it shall be from new moon to new moon, and from Sabbath to Sabbath, all flesh shall come to worship before me, declares the Lord, declares Yahweh. So this is the end of time. And, the new heavens and the new earth have been established, and it says that from every new moon to new moon and from Sabbath to Sabbath, people will come and worship before Yahweh. So it seems as though there would be a reason to believe that this stuff is eternal like he said it was, and not just lasted until someone fulfilled it. But because I believe that our Western understanding of the word fulfill has been kind of misunderstood. And we can go into the whole big, what does it mean to fulfill if we have to, but I think everyone here pretty much understands that word, but if they don't, then we can. I don't know any more right off the top of my head that literally just say about the feast days happening in the end of time. I mean,
does it talk about doing tabernacles?
That's Zechariah, like we read.
Zechariah.
Yeah, it's Sukkot. Now, I know that we can look at like Revelation 21 or chapter 14 or something. Actually, look, Revelation 22:14 says, and this is, this is the very end of the book of Revelation. There's only 21 verses in the last chapter, and in verse 14 it says, "Blessed are those doing his commandments, so that the authority shall be theirs unto the tree of life to enter through the gates into the city. Outside are the dogs, those who enchant with drugs, and those who whore, and the murderers, and the idolaters, and those who love to do falsehood." So at the end of time, you can see that those who have the right to the tree of life, which gives eternal life, as in Genesis chapter 3 would state. Remember, God said, let's kick them out of the garden lest they take a hold of the tree of life and live forever. Yeah, it says right here in verse 22 of chapter 3 of Genesis said, "And Yahweh said, See, the man has become like one of us, to know good and evil. And now, lest he put out his hand and take also of the tree of life and eat and live forever. So God sent him out of the Garden of Eden to till the ground from which he was taken." So the tree of life grants eternal life. We were denied access to it in the Garden of Eden. Yet in Revelation 22, verse 14 says, "Those who are doing his commandments have authority, and to theirs shall be under the tree of life." So, which gives you eternal life. So only those who are keeping his commandments are those who have eternal life. If we look, I know, and we're not going to say that, we're not going to go into legalism, because I believe that it's not just the commandments. Because if you look at Revelation chapter 14, verse 12, couple this with Matthew, which talks when Jesus says, "He who endures to the end shall be saved." Revelation 14:12 says, "Here is the endurance of the holy ones, those guarding the commandments of God and the belief of Jesus." So, endure to the end and you're saved. Revelation says this is the endurance of the saints, those who guard the commands and the faith and testimony of Jesus. So it has to be coupled. But if we have the faith and testimony of Jesus, walking as he walked, then by definition we're keeping the commandments. So if we're keeping the commandments that way, as Revelation 22 would suggest, we have right to the tree of life because we would be walking as he walked and having faith in him. So it all ties together. And I know we just ran from Genesis to Revelation in that, but
I was thinking of that in regards to like where it talks about the Sabbaths and festivals being shadows of things to come.
Colossians chapter 2.
And then with like the Lord's Prayer, where it talks about your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven.
Mm-hmm.
Just with like looking at what we've been talking about, and then doing here on earth how it would be done in heaven. But still, since we're on earth, it's like it is still just a shadow.
Yeah, it's like Jim Staley says, it's a rehearsal. Because one day, we're going to be keeping these feasts in the kingdom, and right now we have the chance to actually get familiar and practice with them. Everything that is given on earth is a shadow of something in heaven. That's why Moses was given instructions in Exodus chapter 32 on how to build a tabernacle. He said, "Because see that you make it exactly how I have shown you," because it was a shadow of the one that was in heaven. So even the tabernacle itself had to be constructed as a shadow of that in heaven. And Hebrews, I believe, talks about that a lot. So everything that's given to us is something that God requires and it has in heaven. So think of it this way. In the kingdom of heaven, is God's character fully encompassed? Yes or no? Okay, I would assume it would be. It wasn't a trick question.
Okay.
I didn't even know what that meant.
Okay, so like if you're in the kingdom of heaven, would that not be the source of God's character? Like everything that he is would be there, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so take this in a Trinitarian idea that Jesus is God. Jesus would have been everything that God is. Jesus kept the feast days here. Therefore, he would be doing the same thing in heaven now where he's at. Because it says he is the same yesterday, today, and forevermore. So, if That's the complete character of God up there, which is encompassed in such as the feast days and being holy. Actually, in Leviticus 11, around the food laws, it says, "Be holy, for I am holy." So he's setting this standard. He says, "Be holy, because I am already holy up here in heaven. I wouldn't be eating that, because I'm holy." So, if we're trying to walk as he walked and be as holy as he is, and to have his character and to know him, as John would say, then we need to be doing these things in our finite, mortal life that we have. That makes sense?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. That could be a good study on the shadows of things. Actually, when Paul writes that in Colossians, he uses the present tense, and he writes the book of Colossians around 55 AD. It says, the feast and new moons and Sabbaths are shadows of things to come, not were shadows of things that came, because a lot of people think that they were a shadow of Jesus and then he came. But he said they are a shadow of things to come, which means their validity still stands at the moment he wrote this letter, which would have been 55 AD, 20 years after the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ. So they're still standing 20 years after. Why are they not standing now? Unless we've kind of gotten away from our roots and thought that they're not as relevant as they used to be. But as John would say, if you're gonna abide in him, you ought to walk as he walked. Which the word there in verse 6, aphelai, it means to ought, literally just ought to walk or ought to something, but it shows a degree of necessity, and it shows a degree of responsibility. Like you're expected to do this. So if you don't, then you're not living up to the full expectation of what you're expected to do. So if we literally do want to abide in him, we're expected, we must walk as he walked. And again, the successionists were not doing that. They were, if we'll notice when we get later on in the book, they weren't loving their brother. They possibly even murdered somebody. There's slight clues that you could pull from the book to say that it might have happened because of the comparison between Cain and Abel that John brings up in chapter 3. So these people were not, they were lawless people, like that, just lawless. They weren't walking as he walked. So if we're going to be the opposite of these lawless people, then we're going to be the lawful people of God, which keep his commandments, as verse 3 would say, and know him. So any questions on this this little part before we go on? Okay, so let's get we got verse 7 through 11 in our in the next section here. Beloved, I'm sorry, my throat's kind of dry. Beloved, I do not write a new commandment to you, but an old commandment, which you have had from the beginning. The old commandment is the word that you have heard. At the same time, it is a new commandment that I am writing to you, which is true in him and is true in you, because the darkness is fading away or passing away, and the true light is already shining. Whoever says he is in the light and hates his brother is still in darkness. Whoever then loves his brother, he abides in the light, and in him there is no cause for stumbling, or he is not a cause of stumbling. But whoever hates his brother is in the darkness, and he walks in the darkness, and he does not know where he is going, because the darkness has blinded his eyes. Okay, so we look at verse 7 here. Usually when John wants to introduce a new topic in this letter, or this sermon, he uses the word agapetoi, which is beloved ones, plural. And he opens it here. Beloved, I'm not writing you not writing you a new commandment, but an old commandment which you had from the beginning. Now, whenever you look at Johannine literature and you see this phrase "from beginning," aparche or NRK, then you must hearken back to the prologue of his gospel. In the beginning was the Word. NRK ein halagos. Halagos ein han prostan theon. Theon ein halagos. In the beginning was the Word. The Word was with God. The Word was God. So, what has been from the beginning. You remember last week when we talked about the imperfect tense of the verb to be, which is like was. Remember how I showed you that the particular way that John uses this word denotes the fact that there is no aspect of time to this. It always was. So in the beginning was the Word. Okay? There was never a time when the Word was not in the beginning. It's forever backwards. Okay? But its implications are forever forwards, just by the use of this one little word. Now, and we lose that in the English translation because we just can't see that in the English. Excuse me? Oh, I thought someone said something. Okay, so he uses the same exact verb in this verse right here. I'm not writing a new commandment, but the old commandment which you had from the beginning. Okay, which was from the beginning. The same thing here. It's the same exact thing. It's that which was forever past, forever in the beginning. What is the only thing that has been forever in the beginning that John has ever talked about to this point? Jesus. Okay, so this old commandment which we're writing, is Him. Now, what was Jesus? What was He made flesh?
The Word.
The Word. What was the Word?
God.
Yes, but more specifically, what was the Word, the incarnation? What did He incarnate Himself from? Right. Okay, so God took on human flesh. So God's character dwelled in human flesh. Now, what did we just say defines God's character more than anything in the world? His commandments, right? Because it's exactly how He would walk, right? So if the full embodiment of His commandments, which is His character, becomes flesh and becomes incarnated, then it would become into Jesus. Then Jesus is the incarnation of the Word. The incarnation of all the commandments which God has ever give, because they are of His character. So you can see he's clumping every single commandment God has ever given into one noun, which is the Logos, the Word, which was from the beginning. Okay? So, but then John goes on this whole little thing right after he says, I'm not writing you a new commandment, but an old commandment which you have heard from the beginning. He says in the next verse, in verse 8, at the same time, it is a new commandment that I'm writing to you, which is true and in Him and in you, because the darkness is passing away and the true light is already shining. Who stood up at the festival of dedication in the 13th chapter of John and said, I am the light of the world?
Jesus.
Boom. How'd you guess that?
I heard you mention it once or twice.
Right. Now, we just defined in verse 5 through 10 of chapter 1 of this letter that God is light. God defines light. Okay? Now, if God is light, but Jesus says He's the light of the world, and John's dealing with this whole dualistic idea that light overcomes darkness and darkness is defeated by light, and light is good and darkness is evil. Then he says that in verse 8 that the darkness is passing away. Literally is present tense, is passing away, and the true light is already shining. He says this he says this immediately following the incarnation of Jesus. So, would he not be continuing this idea that Jesus is this light that is already shining, which is the light of God in the world, in the darkness? He's the way, the truth, and the life. I am the light, I am the good shepherd, I am the door. All this ego eimi statements, which is making all of the darkness pass away. Because as we learned in the beginning of this book, that the darkness cannot shine in the light. If you look, what verse was it? Verse 5 of chapter 1 says, because God is light, and in Him there is no darkness at all. Okay, so darkness cannot exist in a room that light exists in. You can have shadows, but you cannot have darkness where the light is shining, in direct line of the light. So if Jesus is standing here and He's the light of the world, you cannot be in darkness and be in Him. Okay? Which leads to verse 9. It says, whosoever says he is in the light and hates his brother is still in the darkness. So this is probably another thing that these successionists have done. They are saying, I'm in the light. You know, Gnostics love the dualistic idea of good versus evil, light versus darkness. So they're saying, I'm in the light. We're in the light because God is light. They love this idea. But John comes in and says, right after he just got done ripping him again for not keeping the commandments, he says that whoever hates his brother and says he's in the light is not really in the light. Now, and it's really cool because John does go on to a tangent in this in the next chapter. But misown, which is the Greek word to hate, this is not just a I just don't really like you kind of feeling. This is a premeditated, like, deep hatred, like animosity, anger, resentment, just hate, like to the most extensive level that we can define in English. So whoever hates his brother is not in the light. So there's something going on with these people because they're hating their brothers. Some evidence has been shown, because John's writing this, that something has happened that he's having to write this about. So these people are evil people. They're hateful people. Okay? Now, to take this into a practical application, I tend to try to say that I don't literally hate anybody. But I'm sure there are plenty of times when we all slip up and we just get this mean feeling in our gut against somebody because they've done us wrong or they've done someone we love wrong or something like that. To take this into a philosophical idea, because some people will say, well, if Jesus is really in you, then you can't hate anybody. Okay, because Jesus can't hate anybody. Don't want to get too deep into that, but I don't believe it's impossible for an all-loving God to still not be able to hate something, or hate someone, because sometimes the love of God is what makes him hate something. Okay, to put this in a different way, let's think of this. I love my mother very dearly. Okay. Now, someone has come to her and has attacked her, and let's say they've beat her down. Because I love my mother, I hate them. So hate can be stemmed from love. Moreover, I could say that my girlfriend, which I hope she never does this, becomes extremely addicted to illicit drugs. Okay? And is on the road to destruction. Like she's killing herself in a way. Now, because I love her, I can hate the part of her that is killing her. You know, the thing that is killing her at the same time. So my hate for something can stem from my love. But when we take this into the context of John says, if we hate our brother, which is someone in the faith, someone who we have fellowship with, as he would have said in chapter 1, if we hate them, no matter what, if we hate them, he leaves it broad and vague for a reason, we are not in the light. Therefore, we're in the darkness, and the darkness is soon fading away. So we have taken the choice to abide in that which is finite and abide in that which is passing away. It might have a cool seat right now on earth, but eventually that all is going to pass away, as Peter would say, with fire this time, not water, and that all the wicked shall be left here to burn with it. Now, I think that's crazy how John can bring that down to just a hateful a sense. But what did Christ say back in the gospel? I think it was in the Sermon on the Mount, that if you hate your brother, you've already committed murder. It's the same as committing murder. So, would someone who is in the light commit murder? Like just premeditated murder? No. Otherwise, they wouldn't be in the light anymore. like I said, John fleshes this out in the next chapter, which is really awesome because he brings in the Cain and Abel account. But nonetheless, hatred goes a lot further than what we think. I used to hate when people would just say, "Oh, I hate you," just playing around, because I literally just couldn't stand for someone to say something like that because it felt so derogatory or demeaning of me or anybody around me. Now I would request for them not to say that. But I think we could do a better job of really, really, really trying to show that love to people that we might not agree with all the time, especially on biblical matters, because it's so difficult sometimes when you've got somebody who you wish to help so much, or wish to just have a nice conversation with, or come let us reason, as Isaiah would say, and yet they still don't want to listen, or they don't want to hear you out, or they just think you're a crazy, extra hardcore biblical guy. It's like that kind of stuff. Personally, for me, like brings up animosity in my soul. I'm like, oh, I just get so infuriated by these people. But I have to remember what he says here, that if you hate your brother, you're not in the light. So don't let this anger that has stemmed from love, because I love this person enough to want to help them, and yet when they refuse my help, I start growing this anger and animosity that can eventually lead to a hatred if I don't settle it down. I don't want to get that far into it. I want to make sure I nip this in the bud and take care of this before it gets to a level upon which I find myself in my own spiritual problems. I know Aaron mentioned that God does hate some people. We're not going to go into that. I've got a study on that. If somebody ever wants it, I'll send them the PDF for it. Like necromancers and stuff like that are included. But anyway, we're talking about us hating our brother. Now, verse 10, let's look at this. It says, "Whoever loves his brother abides in the light, and in him there is no cause for stumbling." Now, he just talked about those who are in the darkness, hate their brother. Contrasted this, which is it's a common Johannine theme, that whoever loves his brother abides in the light, and in him there is no cause for stumbling. Now, it's debated whether or not this cause for stumbling that John is talking about, because we just don't have enough context, we don't think, is for the unbelieving or for the believing. We're not really sure. I haven't been able to put my finger on it. But nonetheless, the overarching theme here is that, excuse me, whoever loves his brother is in the light. Okay? It doesn't matter how much wrong they've done you. It doesn't matter what kind of stuff you've had to go through because of your brother. It doesn't matter what you're going to have to face because of your brother's fault. You should not, if you're in the light, you cannot hate him. You must love him. Okay, even if that means a separation of you from your brother. Now, we're actually going to deal with that again later on in this book. I know there's so much that we're going to deal with, because John, he fleshes out all these ideas in the beginning towards the end of the book. Because we even get to the idea of the word for hate meaning a separation, and not just an animosity between two brothers or two people. But again, he goes back into cyclical understanding in verse 11 and says, "But whoever hates his brother is in the darkness and walks in the darkness." So he is conducting his life in the darkness. Remember that Hebrew idiom, to walk. He's conducting his life in the darkness, he who hates his brother. But he does not know where he's going, because the darkness has blinded his eyes. Now, I want to say this. What does Matthew 7 say about the narrow path and the broad path? Which path has more people on it? The broad path. Okay. What does the broad path lead to? Yes, it leads to destruction. Now, we're about to get deep on this, because I know we didn't have a lot of stuff, but we're gonna cross a couple books real fast. Let me read that in Matthew 7. It's in verse 13 through 14, if anybody wants to go there real fast. Matthew 7:13 says, "Enter through the narrow gate, because the gate is wide and the way is broad that leads to destruction, and there are many who enter through it. Because the gate is narrow and the way is hard pressed or afflicted, which leads to life, and there are few who find it. Now look at the attributes of the broad path as in verse 13. Because the gate is wide and the way is broad that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. Okay, so it leads to destruction, and there are a lot of people going down this path. Turn to 2 Peter chapter 3. And this is going to be a little review for some of you, I'm sure. But we're going to look at verse 14 through 17. Okay? I'll give you a second to turn there. Everybody good?
Yes.
Okay, 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 14 says, "So then, beloved ones, looking forward to this, do your utmost to be found in him in peace, spotless and blameless, and reckon the patience of our Lord as deliverance, as also our beloved brother Paul wrote to you, according to the wisdom given to him, as also in all his letters, speaking in them concerning these matters, in which some are hard to understand, and those who are untaught and unstable twist to their own" what? Destruction, as they do the other scriptures. You then, beloved ones, being forewarned, watch, lest you also fall from your own steadfastness, being led away with the delusion of the lawless. So what happens to those who are on the broad path? What are they leading to? Destruction. What happens to those who twist Paul's letters to support lawlessness? They're twisting to their own destruction. Okay? What has the majority of the world believed based on Paul's letters concerning the law of God? That we don't have to do it anymore. Okay? Now, what did Jesus say? Go back to Matthew chapter 7. And we're going to read a little bit further on that and see what he has to say a little bit further. We're going to just start in verse 21. Says, "Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, shall enter into the reign of the heavens, but he who is doing the desire of my Father in the heavens." There's that desire of God again. "Many shall say to me in that day, Lord, Lord, have we not prophesied in your name, cast out demons in your name, and done mighty works in your name? And then I shall declare to them, I never knew you." Not I knew you for a little time. "I never knew you. Depart from me, you who work" what? Lawlessness. And if the translation you're reading reads evildoers or something like that, if you look at the Greek, it's anomia, which is the negative way to say nomos, anomia. It's like anti-law, literally lawlessness. So when we look at Revelation again, it says those who have the access to the tree of life are those who guard the commandments and the testimony of Jesus. The testimony of Jesus would be to walk as Jesus walked. Therefore, you would be guarding the commandments. So it seems to be like that narrow path is those who few find it, but those who lead to life, and few who find it. But the broad path is that who leads to destruction. Going back to what John has been saying here in verse 11, "Whoever hates his brother is in the darkness and walks in darkness and does not know where he is going, because the darkness has blinded his eyes." Would you agree that the darkness is the broad path that leads to destruction? Would you agree that the broad path, the people who are on it probably don't know where they're going because they think they're on the good path? Because you can look at pretty much anybody in the world and say, "Are you, what do you believe? You think you're on the right trail to heaven or to whatever you believe the afterlife is?" Well, yeah, sure. They've been led away by the delusion, and now they're walking in the darkness, which leads to destruction down that broad path. So in a cyclical way, we can go back and we can see from Paul's letters, Matthew's writings, the words of Jesus, and the first epistle of John, that keeping his commandments, as verse 3 would say, is the way which we know him, is the way which we have come to know him, and is the way which we find life in him. Okay? Because, and we're not being legalistic, remember, we are simply saying that if we do know him, we are keeping his commandments because we are walking as he walked and are having the same code of ethics that he has. Therefore, when you're persecuted for this way of walking, for this path of life which you've chosen to go down, this narrow path, because those on the broad path believe they're on the narrow path, and they persecute you, you have to remember the words of Matthew 5, chapter 5, verse 10, which says, "Blessed are those who persecuted for righteousness' sakes, because theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake. Those who are walking as he walked. The people of the world, the people in the darkness, didn't recognize who he was 2,000 years ago, and they're not going to recognize who his true followers are 2,000 years later. And they're going to persecute them because they believe they're the true followers and not those who are living the righteous life, because they've been twisted to their own destruction and are leading down that broad path which leads to destruction. And as Peter would say, that broad path ends in the world burning in fire and all those who are left in it.